Hello and welcome. The history of the English language. Enter the Celtic people. Now, back in the Bronze Age or sometime around then, England was home to these people called the Celts. Unlike people now, these blue avatars were much more blue, to say the least, and spoken languages such as Gaelic, Welsh, and Briton, mind you, spelled with an E. Their words were mainly normal, everyday phrases which involved things like war, conflict, and battle. Of course, they also had words for places like hills, valleys, and rocks, but let's be honest, when will you ever use those, right? Now, before the Romans came and, quote, unforcefully integrated Celts into their culture, their language influenced many parts of Central Europe. One of the works found to be related to the Celts is the Warlord Chronicles, which is to say their culture had a lot of bloodshed. Yeah. And since we're talking about war and bloodshed, let's move along on our imaginary timeline to the Romans. Now, after a couple hundred years in 55 BC, England was invaded by the Romans. The settled Celts were so intimidated they retreated to the Celtic fringe. Now, the Romans then established supply routes to maintain their dominance. During their stay, Romans were able to establish a monetary system and roads. They also brought with them Latin, which was very important to the English language, the Latin Bible, and Christianity, which is also important to the English language, but we will discuss later. Eventually, England became a Latin-speaking land. So what effect does Latin have on English? Well, Latin lasted in the land, even when the Romans were defeated in 410. Latin influenced the structure of the language. However, the Roman Empire collapsed and left Britain, leaving the Celts defenseless against invading tribes, thus transitioning into the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons were a Germanic tribe that came across from the North Sea. They consisted of the Saxons, the Angles, and the Jutes. Well, that's what their name is made of, Anglo-Saxons, Jutes. Anyways, these people valued kinship, loyalty to the tribe, and they liked to fight because they saw it as their way of life. Also, a lot of times the Anglo-Saxons fought because of blood feuds, which usually ended up with a lot of bloodshed from both clans because each would want to seek revenge on the other. It was a huge mess. Now, in order to settle this trifle matter, clans would give each other payments in the form of gold or livestock, which was called, back then, wargild. Now, this concept introduced several words into the English language. For instance, at that time, the Celts didn't have iron swords, so the word was adopted into the language that Celts used. Eventually, the Celtic language and the Germanic languages merged into the huge Modge Podge mess that we now call English. Weird, eh? While the Anglo-Saxons were in Britain, they did little to keep the legacy of the Romans alive, since they spoke Old English. After they settled in Britain, their language became the dominant language, and their way of life ended when Edward the Confessor died in 1066, which we will discuss in our next section. The Vikings sailed to the Isle of Portland in Dorset and started to raid. This happened a bit after the Anglo-Saxons moved in. The Vikings were violent and bloody, and they quickly took control of almost all of England. They targeted monasteries, mainly because they were filled with treasure and the monks really didn't know how to fight back. The Vikings later figured out that there was a faster way to earn money than to bully monks, which is through tax and trade. They settled down on the eastern side of England, which was called Danelaw. Yeah, it's very confusing since it's not actually a law, and they started taxing people. This tax was called Dane gold. Of course, Dane gold. As they traded, their culture influenced and mixed in with many people and the land. They named the days after their gods: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and so on. You know the days of the week, I hope. And after the defeat of their king in the Battle of Hastings, which I will discuss later, they basically merged with the French people. Oops, spoiler alert. Enter the Normans, or the French, as I've alluded to just then. Before William the Conqueror took over England in 1066 AD, King of Saxons Alfred the Great planned the revival of education and religion with Old English instead of Latin. He had contributed greatly to the translations of the history of the English Church and the people, and the other book called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which was documented the history from the invasion of Caesar to 1154 AD. Bored? It's okay, I have more. Soon after the death of Edward the Confessor, a fight erupted between three very important people in a war that is now referred to as the Battle of Hastings, and which has nothing to do with the word haste. Harold, spelled with an O, of Saxonland, Harold, spelled with an A, of Norway, and William of Normandy, without a cool nickname, all wanted the throne. After a period of fighting, William the Conqueror, which was the no-nickname guy, was anointed King of England, because he basically waited until both Harolds were done fighting before he came over. Anyway, the Norman-French invasion, which was what this time was called, was a period of transition from Old English to Middle English of Latin-based French. Sorry, Alfred the Great. Well, since the French invaders came in, the Anglo-Saxons were looked down on as inferior. The French became the dominant language for the upper class, while Old English remained tied to the Anglo-Saxons. And as you might have guessed, people needed to communicate between social classes, and so intermingling of lower and upper class citizens became common, thus making English more diverse. Some of the changes in language involved phrases or words regarding topics such as the government, the military, the court, and the food. For example, words like peace, crown, beef, rule, and prison were some common vocabulary introduced by the French. Not only was the vocabulary affected, though, grammar rules, prefixes, and suffixes had also been altered. In the end, English became an assortment of different languages combined like a linguistic buffet, which ultimately helped cook up works such as Romeo and Juliet, in which we will discuss in our next segment. Enter the early modern English people. Yes, the early modern English people. There's a distinction. Now, dated from the 1558 to 1625, the Elizabethan era, or the Age of Shakespeare, is easily known as the Golden Age, or the Age of English Literature. Of course, English literature is always gold, right? Anyway, by the time of the mid-16th century to the 17th century during the Renaissance, the English language went through great alterations and became modernized. The modernizing stages were primarily due to the wish to incorporate classical languages into English at that time. These changes included the Great Vowel Shift, which changed various, you guessed it, vowels, but also consonants and syntax. Unlike the previous sections, though, the vocabulary words added to this period did not result from an invasion. It was more like a borrowing, or like Shakespeare, an invention of weird words like honey. Additionally, since Latin was considered language of the wise, educated people, of course Latin, the desire to adapt to the more sophisticated languages became a major component to this period of time. Greek-based suffixes, including is and ism, were introduced. Not that anyone cares, but hey, it's English, you gotta know this. Enter Samuel Johnson. Nope, not Samuel Jackson, go back. Yep, Samuel Johnson, or otherwise known as Modern English. Although some may argue that Modern English encompasses Samuel Johnson's History of the English Language dictionaries, we've decided to split them apart since it is one of the most influential texts out there in regards to the formation of the English language. Although there were some scholars who tried to incorporate more words from Latin into English, it was generally not that popular amongst the people who spoke English. Let's start talking about this before Mr. Johnson's little book. The predecessor of Samuel Johnson, Robert Cowdrey, published an English dictionary in 1604 before him. Now, followed by his work, several other dictionaries were also published in the 17th and 18th century. However, all of these dictionaries had different definitions, the spelling of words, and the general lack of credible content. The first English dictionary that was considered reliable was Samuel Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, which was published in 1755. It contained about 43,000 words. Yeah, not much, right? But 43,000 words, not including the definitions. Yeah, that's a whole lot of reading. With the lack of firm rules, there were some calls for linguistic reforms, such as the 37-letter alphabet system that was introduced and the banning of certain vocabulary words. And no, they were not profanity. But in the end, English language remained flexible and many followed Johnson's dictionary in his spelling and word usage. And so, in the 18th century, grammar rules were also introduced because Johnson's dictionary did not include them. Well, best known work was Robert Loth's short introduction to an English grammar, which had many grammar rules that we use today. Thanks a lot, Robert. Ultimately, English transformed from a bundle of phonetics from various languages that pretty much sound like gibberish, as most foreign languages tend to sound like to people, into something that is vaguely distinguishable as comprehensible material for communication. Of course, later on, other words like slang and internet memes were also integrated into English, or what remains of it. And also, the pronunciation of many words were also changed for the better or worse is based on viewers' discretion. Well, thanks for joining us. If you have any questions regarding the credibility of our sources, we will insert links below for viewers like you. Au revoir!